Every soul in Calder Flats knew that Joel Ramsey stood at the edge of the train platform every single Tuesday, hat in hand, watching the westbound locomotive pull away with an expression that could only be described as a man holding something precious and invisible at the same time. And not a single living person in that town could tell you who he was waiting for. It was the year 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was a place of red dust, hard men, wide skies, and stories that traveled faster than horses. Calder Flats sat at the base of the Sangre de Cristo foothills like a town that had simply decided to stay put when everything else was moving westward. It had a general store run by a man named Herbert Cobb, who kept a ledger tighter than a new saddle. It had a saloon called the Painted Spur, where men argued over cards and drank whiskey that tasted like it had come from a barrel that had seen better days. It had a church with a bell that rang twice on Sunday, a livery stable, a small schoolhouse, and a sheriff named Dale Prout who liked things quiet and orderly and mostly got his wish. It was a town that functioned like a clock, every person a gear, every day a tick, and Joel Ramsey was its most talked-about mystery. Joel was 28 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual work rather than vanity, with dark brown hair that curled at the back of his neck when it grew too long between cuts. His eyes were the color of creek water in summer, a shifting kind of green-gray that made people feel, when he looked at them directly, that he was truly paying attention. He ran a cattle operation about 4 miles outside of town on land his father had left him. He was not rich by any measure, but he was solvent, which in 1878 New Mexico was its own kind of success. He employed 2 ranch hands, a quiet man named Ezra Polk who had ridden with him since they were both young and foolish, and a newer hand called Pete Dunn, who was good with horses and terrible at conversation. What the town knew about Joel Ramsey was this. He was steady, he was fair, he paid his debts on time, he attended church when work allowed, he bought his supplies without complaint, and every Tuesday when the train came through heading west, he walked to that platform and watched it arrive and watched it leave, and sometimes he spoke to the station master, a reed-thin man named August Farley, and sometimes he only nodded. He never got on the train. He never met anyone coming off it. He just watched. Speculation had run through Calder Flats the way water runs through a dry creek bed after rain, all at once and without direction. Mrs. Prout, the sheriff's wife, believed Joel was waiting for a woman he'd loved in his youth who had gone east and refused to come back. Old Herbert Cobb was convinced it was a business partner who kept canceling. The women who gathered at the church on Wednesday mornings for Bible study had cycled through no fewer than 11 different theories, ranging from a long-lost sibling to a military contact to a case of unrequited love, so profound it had calcified into ritual. The men at the Painted Spur simply respected that a man had his reasons and didn't pry, which was perhaps the most reasonable position of all. Joel himself never offered an explanation. When August Farley finally asked him directly, on a warm October Tuesday in 1877, Joel had only smiled in that quiet way of his and said he was keeping track of something, and August had decided that was as good an answer as he was going to get. The truth of it was both simpler and more complicated than the town imagined. Alma Bristol arrived in Calder Flats on a Wednesday in April of 1878, which meant she arrived on entirely the wrong day for Joel to be at the platform, and that itself seemed to set the tone for everything that came after. She came on the eastbound train, not the westbound, which was itself an anomaly, because almost everyone who arrived in Calder Flats was going west, chasing something. Alma Bristol arrived from the direction of the east, which meant she was not chasing. She was, in the specific and complicated language of her own particular life, landing. She was 24 years old, and she had dark auburn hair pinned up under a hat that had survived the journey from St. Louis with only minor damage to its ribbon. She had green eyes, not the uncertain kind but the decided kind, the kind that looked at a place and took its measure quickly and quietly. She was medium height, slim in the way of someone who had been working hard and eating practically, and she carried a single large trunk and a carpet bag and a leather satchel that she clutched to her side the way people clutch things that contain important papers or irreplaceable objects. The satchel contained both. It held the deed to a piece of land outside Calder Flats that had belonged to her uncle, Warren Bristol, who had died in January of consumption and left her his property in his will because she was his only living relative and because, as the lawyer's letter had explained, he had always admired her practicality. It also held every letter Warren had ever sent her, which she had kept in a tin box and then transferred to the satchel for the journey because she could not bear for them to be in the trunk where they might get wet or lost. Alma had been a bookkeeper in St. Louis, working for a dry goods trading company run by a man named Hargrove who was not unkind, but who paid her 60% of what he paid men doing identical work, which she knew because she did the payroll herself. She had been saving money for 3 years. She had been planning. And then Warren had died and left her 30 acres of New Mexico land and a cabin and a small herd of cattle, and the plan had shifted and expanded and become something she barely dared to name because naming it made it real and real things could be taken from you. What she wanted was to run her own operation, a small one. She was not a dreamer in the romantic sense. She was a dreamer in the precise sense, someone who could see the numbers of a thing and know whether they added up. 30 acres could support a modest cattle operation if managed correctly. She had read everything she could find on the subject. She had written letters to Warren's neighbors asking about the land and the water situation and the nearest markets. She had planned her first year's budget in 3 different scenarios: optimistic, realistic, and what she privately called the honest one. She had not planned on arriving in Calder Flats to find that Warren's neighbor had been running his cattle on Warren's land without permission for the past 2 years and considered the arrangement ongoing. His name was Gerald Hatch, and he was the first person to speak to her when she stepped off the train, which should have told her something. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with a reddish face and the particular confidence of someone who had been the largest person in most rooms for a long time. He introduced himself pleasantly enough and said he'd heard Warren Bristol's niece was coming, and that he hoped she'd be reasonable about the land situation. Alma had looked at him with those green eyes for a moment and said, very calmly, that she was sure she would be, once she understood what the land situation was. Gerald Hatch had explained it. His cattle had been grazing on Warren's south field for 2 years because Warren had been too sick to use it and had asked Gerald to keep an eye on things. Gerald felt this informal arrangement entitled him to continue use of the south field indefinitely, or at minimum until the spring roundup, and he hoped Alma would see the common sense of that. Alma had thanked him for meeting her, picked up her carpet bag, and walked to the hotel to check in and think. The hotel was called the Calder House, and it was run by a woman named Mabel Briggs, who had the aspect of someone who had weathered many things without being diminished by any of them. She was perhaps 55, with silver hair and sharp eyes, and she took Alma's money and showed her to a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the main street. She asked, in the direct manner of a woman who has no interest in circumlocution, whether Alma had just arrived on the eastbound. Alma said she had. Mabel said she hoped Gerald Hatch hadn't gotten to her already. Alma said he had. Mabel made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated a great deal, and said that Alma should talk to Sheriff Pruitt in the morning, and also that she should talk to Joel Ramsey, because Joel knew cattle and knew the law around grazing rights better than anyone in the territory, and furthermore because Joel's land bordered Warren Bristol's land on the north side, which made him relevant. Alma filed both names away and ate the supper that Mabel brought up on a tray because the dining room was already closed, and she read through Warren's letters until the lamp oil burned low, and then she lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of a town she didn't know yet and told herself, firmly and without sentiment, that she was going to be all right. She went to see Sheriff Prout first thing in the morning. He was a careful, methodical man who listened to the whole of what she said before he responded, which she appreciated. He told her that Gerald Hatch's claim was not legally supportable. Informal arrangements made with a dying man did not constitute a lease or an easement, but that it was also not a simple matter of telling Gerald to move his cattle, because Gerald Hatch had a temper and 6 men working for him, and a pattern of making things difficult for people who crossed him. He advised her to get a survey done, get it documented, and approach the matter carefully. He also mentioned Joel Ramsey. Specifically, he said that if she was going to operate Warren's land, it would be worth knowing that her northern neighbor was a straight-dealing man who would not cause her trouble, and that Joel might be willing to advise her on the particulars of running cattle in that part of the territory. Alma thanked the sheriff and walked back out into the April morning, which was bright and warm in the way New Mexico mornings are, all clean light and thin air. And she looked up the street and saw the livery stable and the general store and the painted spur, and tried to feel the shape of this place, its rhythms and its politics, because every place had both, and you needed to understand them before you could operate within them. She went to the general store first to introduce herself to Herbert Cobb and establish a credit account, which she did efficiently and without fuss. Herbert Cobb was surprised by her. She could tell, not by the fact of her specifically, but by the speed and clarity with which she conducted business, because he had apparently expected something else. She didn't let his surprise bother her. She had been surprising men like Herbert Cobb her entire working life. She asked him, while she was filling her first order, whether he knew Joel Ramsey. Herbert said that everyone knew Joel Ramsey, and that Joel came in on Fridays usually, and that he was a fair man if you were straight with him. And also, Herbert seemed compelled to add this, that Joel was a solitary man, not unfriendly but self-contained, and had been that way for as long as Herbert had known him. Alma said she would be needing to speak with him about the shared boundary of their land. Herbert nodded and said that made sense. It was in the general store that Alma first heard about the Tuesday thing. A woman named Clara Yates, who had come in to purchase flour and could not resist entering any conversation that presented itself, mentioned that if Alma wanted to find Joel Ramsey on a day other than Friday, she might try the train platform on Tuesday morning, because Joel was there every single week without fail, large as life, watching the train. Alma said that was interesting. Clara said the whole town had theories. Alma said she supposed they did. She did not go to the platform that first Tuesday, because she had driven out to Warren's land and was spending the day assessing the property, walking the fence lines, counting cattle, and looking at the condition of the cabin, which needed work but was structurally sound. She found evidence of Gerald Hatch's cattle on the south field. Their tracks and droppings were impossible to miss, and she made careful notes. She did, however, meet Joel Ramsey on a Thursday, which was 11 days after she arrived in Calder Flats, and it happened in a way that neither of them had planned. She was at the land, working on the south fence line where 3 posts had rotted at the base and needed replacing. She had brought tools and replacement posts from town in a borrowed wagon, and she was doing the work herself because she could not yet afford to hire hands. She was not struggling with it. She had done harder physical work than this, but she was deeply focused, which was perhaps why she did not hear the approach of a horse until it was quite close. She turned and found a man on a sorrel horse looking down at her from the north side of the fence, which was his side, and she knew immediately from the way Mabel Briggs had described him, quietly, matter-of-factly, as if describing something that was simply accurate, that this was Joel Ramsey. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, not surprise exactly, something more like attention, focused and careful. "You would be Alma Bristol," he said, and it was not a question. "I would be," she said, and straightened up from where she had been crouching over a post hole. "And you would be my northern neighbor." "Joel Ramsey," he said, and dismounted without being invited to, because the fence being in that state was as much his business as hers. He tied his horse to a standing post and came through the gap where the broken section was and looked at her work. He looked at it the way someone looks at a thing when they're trying to be accurate rather than polite, and then he said, "You've got the depth right. Most people go too shallow." She felt something shift slightly in her assessment of him. "I read that you need to go down at least 2 feet in this kind of soil," she said. "You read it," he repeated, not with skepticism but with a kind of interest. "I read everything I could find about running land in this territory before I came," she said. "I am not in the habit of attempting things I haven't prepared for." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up one of the replacement posts she'd leaned against the standing fence and examined it. "These are good wood," he said. "Where'd you get them?" "Cobb's," she said. "He had them in the back. Herbert doesn't usually stock these." "He had them," I asked specifically. Joel Ramsey set the post down and looked at her with that Creekwater gaze, and she met it without difficulty, because she had been looked at by enough people for enough different reasons that looking back had become simply a thing she did. "I heard about your situation with Hatch," he said. "Most people seem to have," she said. "He's been letting his cattle drift onto this land for 2 years," Joel said. "I've seen it from my side. If you need a witness who can confirm the extent of the use, I can do that." She studied him for a moment. "Why would you do that?" He looked at the fence, then out at the south field. "Because it's right," he said simply. "And because Hatch has been pushing at every boundary in this area for 4 years and someone ought to push back." She turned this over carefully, the way she turned over any offered information, checking its angles. "You've had your own problems with him. He let his cattle through my north fence twice last year," Joel said. "I repaired the fence and told him straight what would happen if it happened again, and he's left my land alone since. But he's a man who only respects force or legal authority, and since you're a woman alone on a new property, he's likely calculated that you have neither." "He's calculated incorrectly," Alma said. Joel Ramsey looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression changed in a way she noticed without being able to fully interpret. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "I'm starting to think he might have," he said. They spent the next 2 hours working on the fence together, because after that exchange it seemed both logical and natural. Joel was not the kind of man who talked while he worked unless there was something worth saying, which Alma appreciated because she was the same way. But he talked when there was something worth saying, and what emerged over those 2 hours was a practical exchange of useful information. The state of the water rights on Warren's land, the best route to the cattle market in Santa Fe, the names of reliable men who could be hired for seasonal work, the specific location of a spring on the northwest corner that Alma hadn't known about. When they were done, the fence line was repaired and both of them were dusty and tired, and the afternoon light was going golden over the Sangre de Cristo range. "I appreciate the help and the information," Alma said. "I'll write a statement for Sheriff Pruitt about what I've observed of Hatch's use of your land," Joel said, fastening his horse's cinch. "I'll bring it to him on Friday." "That's more than I expected," she said honestly. He looked at her over his horse's back. "You came out here alone and started working a fence line," he said. "You didn't ask for help or complain about the situation. That's more than most people would do." She thought about that for a moment, and then she said something she hadn't planned to say, which was unusual for her. "My Uncle Warren wrote me letters about this place for 12 years, she said. Every letter was full of what the land looked like at different times of year, what the sky did, what it felt like to have something that was truly yours. I've been reading those letters since I was 12 years old. This was always where I was going to end up." Joel Ramsey tied off his cinch and stood very still for a moment with his back to her, and she wondered if she had said too much, because she didn't usually say things like that to people she had met 3 hours ago. Then he turned around, and his expression was not uncomfortable or politely neutral the way she had feared. It was something else, something she didn't have a ready word for. "Then you're not here by accident," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not here by accident." He nodded slowly, as if that mattered to him in some way she couldn't yet understand. Then he mounted his horse and touched the brim of his hat and rode back toward his own land, and she watched him go and then turned back to her fence line and told herself not to read anything into the expression on a man's face when she had known him for 3 hours. The following Tuesday, she was in Calder Flats at the general store, and through the window she saw Joel Ramsey walk down the center of the street toward the train platform. It was 10 minutes before the westbound was due, she knew, because she had begun to learn the rhythms of the town. She watched him go, and she thought about what Clara Yates had said: the whole town had theories. And she thought about what Mabel Briggs had said when Alma had mentioned meeting Joel, which was a knowing look and a comment about timing, which Alma had decided not to investigate further. She watched him come back from the platform 20 minutes later, hat in hand, and his face had the look she had heard described but now saw for herself, not quite grief, not quite hope, something held carefully in the space between. She did not stop him to speak. It did not seem like the right moment. What she did instead was go to Warren's cabin and spend the afternoon reading his letters again, all of them in order, from the first one he'd sent when she was 12, and he had just arrived in New Mexico and written to tell her that the sky was a color he didn't have words for yet, to the last one, written in November when his handwriting had gone shaky and slow, in which he said that he had loved this land with everything he had, and that she should come and love it after him, and that it would love her back. She was crying by the end of it, which was normal. She always cried at the last letter. She wiped her face with the hem of her apron and went outside and stood in the late afternoon and looked at what was hers, the red earth and the dry grass and the mountains going pink in the distance. And she said, out loud, to Warren or to the land or to herself, that she was here, she had come, just like he'd told her to. Joel brought his written statement to Sheriff Pruitt on Friday as promised. He also brought Alma, because he had stopped at her land on his way into town and told her she ought to be present. She appreciated that he had not simply done it on her behalf without including her, which some men would have done, calling it helpfulness when it was actually the comfortable exercise of a power they did not think to question. Sheriff Pruitt received the statement and told them he would speak to Gerald Hatch formally and officially, and that Hatch had 48 hours to remove his cattle from the Bristol land or face a formal complaint. He said this in a tone that suggested he expected Gerald to comply, because, however difficult Gerald Hatch could be, he was not yet stupid enough to defy the law outright. After they left the sheriff's office, Joel said, "There's a place in town that makes decent coffee if you want to wait and see if Hatch sends a man to talk." She looked at him. "You think he'll send a man to talk? He'll want to negotiate rather than back down outright," Joel said. "It's how he operates. He'll send someone today." They went to the small restaurant attached to the hotel, which served coffee and pie and simple meals, and they sat across from each other at a table by the window, and it was the first time they had sat down together in any kind of deliberate way, and Alma felt the slight strangeness of it, not uncomfortable but present, like a change in air pressure. "How long have you been in Calder Flats?" she asked, because she wanted to understand the territory of him as precisely as she was learning the territory of her land. 8 years, he said. "I came out from Missouri when I was 20. My father had the land before me. He'd filed the claim in 1862 and built the place up, and when he died I came out to take it over." "Your mother?" she asked, the way you ask when someone mentions a father and not a mother. "She passed when I was 14, he said. "Fever." "I'm sorry," she said. He acknowledged it with a small nod that said he had made his peace with it, as people do when something has been true for long enough. "You lost your parents?" He asked because she had mentioned only Warren. "Both of them, yes," she said. "When I was 18, a river flood in St. Louis, it was 1872. She said it plainly the way she had learned to say it because it was true and it had happened and she had lived past it. Warren was my father's brother. He wrote to me afterward and told me that if I ever needed family I should consider him mine." Joel looked at her with that steady, careful attention. "And you did?" "I did," she said. "Not in the physical sense. I couldn't leave St. Louis easily. I had work and a room and a life that was functioning. But he was family in the sense that mattered. In the letters." She paused. "I know that might sound odd to some people, that letters could be family." "No," Joel said quietly. "It doesn't sound odd." She looked at him, and there was something in his face that made her want to ask about the train platform, but she restrained herself because it was not her question to ask yet if it was ever hers to ask. Gerald Hatch's foreman, a man named Cole Rigby, appeared at the restaurant window 20 minutes later, and Joel Ramsey had been exactly right. Hatch wanted to negotiate. He was offering to pay a grazing fee going forward, if Alma would agree to let the arrangement continue on the south field. Alma thanked Cole Rigby politely and told him to tell Gerald Hatch that the south field was not available for lease at any price, because she would need it herself by the fall, and that she expected his cattle removed within the 48 hours the sheriff had indicated, and that if he had any further questions, he should direct them to her through Sheriff Prout. Cole Rigby left looking like a man who had expected a different conversation. Joel Ramsey looked at Alma across the table with the expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that was adjacent to a smile. That said something without being entirely readable, and he said, "Hatch is going to call you a difficult woman." "He can call me whatever he likes," Alma said, picking up her coffee, "as long as his cattle are off my land." This time it was not adjacent to a smile. It was a real one, and it changed his face entirely, opening something in it that had been kept carefully closed, and she felt it land in her chest in a way she was not ready for and filed away to think about later. Hatch's cattle were off her land within 36 hours. She walked the south field afterward and felt something she could only call satisfaction, which was different from happiness, but was its own complete thing. May came, and Alma fell into the work of the land with the totality of attention she brought to everything. She hired one hand, a weathered man in his 50s named Thomas Vega, who had grown up in this part of New Mexico and knew the land and the cattle and the weather patterns, and spoke with an economy of words that she matched precisely. They got along efficiently and without drama. She also began to know Calder Flats more fully, its people, its social architecture, its small dailies. Mabel Briggs became a friend of sorts, the kind of friendship that forms between women who do not waste each other's time. Clara Yates remained a reliable source of local information, delivered always with more elaboration than necessary, but accurate at its core. Sheriff Prout nodded to her on the street with the particular nod he reserved, she noticed, for people he considered straight-dealing. And Joel Ramsey appeared at her fence line on a Saturday in May with a length of barbed wire that she had been waiting on from a supply order that was running late. And he said that he'd had extra and that they could settle it against the supply order when it arrived, or he could put it in her account as a neighborly gesture, whichever she preferred. She said she preferred to settle accounts clearly, and he said that was fine, and he helped her run the wire. And they talked while they worked more than the first time, because there was more to say now that they knew each other in some basic way. He told her about Missouri, about his father, about learning to run cattle in a landscape entirely different from New Mexico and the adjustments that had required. She told him about bookkeeping in St. Louis, about the meticulous ledgers, about the particular strange pleasure of numbers that balanced exactly. "You have a patience for detail," he said. It was not a compliment exactly, more an observation, but it felt like one. "I notice things," she said. "It's useful." "It is," he agreed, and she thought he might be talking about something other than bookkeeping, but she let it pass. She almost asked him about the train platform that day. It rose in her throat twice while they worked, and twice she put it back because something told her the timing was not right, and Alma Bristol had learned to trust her timing. What she did instead, at the end of the afternoon, when they were rolling up the extra wire, and the sky was going every color it had in its considerable arsenal, was ask him if he wanted to come in for coffee. He went still for a moment, the way she had noticed he went still when something surprised him, not frozen, just very deliberate. "I'd like that," he said. The cabin was small and clean. She had been making it her own incrementally, a curtain here, a different arrangement of furniture there, Warren's letters in their tin box on the shelf. Joel looked at the place with quiet attention and did not comment on what she had done with it or make any of the slightly condescending observations she had half expected. He simply sat where she directed him and accepted the coffee she poured and looked out the window at the evening coming in. "Your uncle made this place livable," he said. "He did," she said. "I've been making it mine." "I can see that," he said. She sat across from him and they drank their coffee in a quiet that was not awkward, which she noted because that was rarer than people seemed to think, a quiet that was simply comfortable, that did not need to be filled. He left when the last light went, thanking her with a simplicity that matched his way of speaking, and she stood in the door of the cabin and watched him ride out, and then she went inside and washed the cups and thought, carefully and honestly, about what was happening. She was not a woman who dramatized her own interior landscape. She had trained herself over years of practical living to see things as they were. What was happening, as best she could assess it, was that she liked Joel Ramsey with an increasing specificity. Not just the general liking of a neighbor who was useful and decent, but the particular liking of someone you wanted to know more of, in more detail, in more light. She found herself thinking about things to tell him. She found herself aware of the distance between his land and hers, 4 miles, which was not far but was not nothing. She recognized all of this. She had felt something like it once before, years ago in St. Louis, with a man who had eventually made it clear that he wanted a wife who managed a home rather than a ledger. And she had understood then that she was not that kind of wife, and he was not the kind of man who could love what she actually was, and she had let it go without too much grief. What she did not yet know about Joel Ramsey was what kind of man he was in the deepest sense, what he loved, what he feared, what he waited for on a train platform every Tuesday with something open and aching on his face that the whole of Calder Flats had watched and wondered about. She found out in June, on a Tuesday evening, and it was not the way she had expected to find out. She had come into town to collect her supply order, which had finally arrived, and she was loading the wagon outside Cobb's General Store when Mabel Briggs came across the street with a purpose to her stride that meant she had something to say. Mabel said it directly, which was her way. "You should know something about Joel Ramsey before you get too far in either direction with him." Alma straightened up. "All right," she said. Mabel told her. 2 years ago, Joel Ramsey had been corresponding with a woman in Kansas City, a woman named Ruth Alderman, a widow, introduced to him through a mutual acquaintance. They had exchanged letters for 6 months, and in those letters they had apparently reached an understanding, or what Joel had understood to be an understanding, and she had said she would come out to see the territory in the fall. That fall, October of 1876, she had written to say she was delayed. He had waited. That was when the Tuesday platform visits had begun. November, she had written again, something had come up, she was not yet able to come. He had kept waiting. December, her letters had slowed. By January of 1877 they had stopped entirely. He had written 3 times. No answer had come, and still he went to the platform every Tuesday. Because he was a man, Mabel said with the careful neutrality of someone who was trying not to judge, who had decided something in those letters and could not easily undecide it, and because he did not yet know what to do with the waiting except continue it. Alma listened to all of this without speaking. Then she said, "Does he know what happened to her? Whether she's all right?" Mabel said she didn't know whether he knew or not. August Farley at the station thought he'd received one more letter around March of 1877, but no one knew what it said. Alma thanked Mabel and drove home in the wagon and was very quiet for the whole 4 miles. She did not see Joel for a week after that, because she was busy, and because she needed to think clearly without the complicating presence of a man she was starting to care about in a way that could hurt her. What she thought about, over those 7 days, was this. She was not a woman who invented feelings in other people to match her own. She had no way of knowing whether Joel felt anything for her beyond neighborly regard. She also had no way of knowing whether he was still waiting, still hoping, still considering himself in some way spoken for by a woman who had stopped writing a year and a half ago. Both of those things were unknown, and Alma Bristol did not act on unknowns. She gathered information first. She also thought, in the private and honest way she thought about difficult things, about what it meant that he kept going. A man who waited that consistently, that quietly for that long, was a man who knew how to be steady. That could mean something good. It could also mean something complicated. She held both possibilities without resolving them, because that was what you did with things that weren't resolved yet. On a Monday in the second week of June, Joel appeared at her land in the early morning with a question about the northwest spring she'd mentioned, because his water situation was tight, and he wondered if the spring put enough out to share. She showed him the spring, and they measured the output together using the practical methods you used when you didn't have fancy equipment, and she told him she thought there was enough to run a pipe to his north pasture if he wanted to build it, and he said he thought she was right, and they stood at the edge of the spring in the cool morning shade of a cottonwood tree, and she told herself she was going to ask him, straight out, about the platform and about Ruth Alderman. She did not do it straight out. She did it sideways, the way you approach a nervous horse. "I've heard you go to the platform every Tuesday," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." "Have you been waiting long?" He was quiet for a long time, looking at the water coming out of the ground, clear and cold in the morning light. "Since October of 1876, he said finally. She waited because she had learned that he filled silence eventually if you let him. "I was in correspondence with someone," he said. "A woman in Kansas City. We'd written back and forth for a long time, and I thought we were going to meet. I thought she was going to come. She kept saying she was coming, and then she stopped saying anything at all." "Do you know why?" Alma asked. He was quiet again. "I got one more letter," he said. "In March of last year, she'd met someone else. She married him in February. She was sorry for not writing sooner, but she hadn't known how to say it." Alma turned this over. "And you've kept going to the platform," she said. "Yes," he said, and he looked up at her then, and there was something almost embarrassed in it, but more than embarrassed, more like a man seeing something about himself clearly for the first time in a while. "I don't know exactly why. Habit, I suppose, or something I can't name yet." "Perhaps it's not about her anymore," Alma said carefully. He held her gaze. "Perhaps not," he said. The cottonwood leaves moved in the small morning wind, and the spring water moved over the stones with its constant quiet sound, and Alma felt the moment for exactly what it was, the turning of something, a direction, a change, and she did not look away from it or diminish it with a practical remark. "I came to this land because I'd been reading about it for 12 years, she said. "Sometimes the waiting is for something you can already picture, and sometimes it's for something you can't picture yet." Joel Ramsey looked at her across the spring, and she thought she was fairly sure that he understood what she was saying, or at least felt the shape of it. He said quietly, "I think I've known that for a while. I'm just slow about some things." They walked back to the cabin, and she made coffee, and they sat in the morning for another hour, and the conversation moved through other things, cattle and water and the dry summer coming. But underneath it was the thing they had said at the spring, lying there like a stone turned over to show what's been living beneath it. He did not come back the following Saturday, which he had sometimes done. She told herself that was fine, that things moved at their own pace and kept working. He came on Wednesday instead. He brought a jar of his housekeeper's preserved peaches. A woman named Grace Polk, Ezra's wife, who kept his house for him and apparently made preserves in quantity, and he stood in the doorway with the jar and said that Grace sent them with her regards to the new neighbor. Alma accepted the peaches and thanked him and invited him in, and they sat at her table. And this time the conversation had a different quality to it, easier, closer, as if the spring had moved things and they were both aware of the movement. He asked her about St. Louis, about the life she'd had there, and she told him honestly, including the bookkeeping and the 60% and the plan she had been building for 3 years. He listened without interrupting, which was the kind of listening that feels like respect rather than patience. "You planned all of this before you knew you'd inherit the land," he said. "I planned to have my own land someday," she said. "I just didn't know it would be this land. And now that it is." She looked out the window at the south field, green with early summer, Warren's cattle grazing where they should be. "Now that it is," she said, "I can't imagine anything else." He looked at her with the Creekwater eyes, and she felt again the thing she had felt in the spring shade of the cottonwood, the turning of something. "I can't either," he said, and she believed he was not talking about the land, or at least not only about the land. They had supper together that evening, because it was late and she had food, and he had not planned to stay so long, but the staying had happened naturally, which she thought was the best way for things to happen. She made biscuits and fried the last of the salt pork, and they ate at the small table with the lamp between them, and he said, around the end of the meal, in the careful way of a man saying something he has thought about, I haven't been at a table with someone else in a long time. I eat alone mostly." She looked up at him. "That's a lonely way to live," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She thought about what that meant and what she wanted to say back to it, and she said, "You're welcome to not eat alone whenever you'd like company." He looked at her very directly, the way he had learned to look at her, and he said, "I'd like that, very much." The summer of 1878 unfolded over them like the sky over New Mexico, large and changing, and full of weather. Alma's land proved itself in July when the cattle rounded up well, and her count was solid, and Thomas Vega told her with his economy of words that she had done well for a first season. Gerald Hatch had moved on to simpler targets after Alma's fence went up properly, though he remained an intermittent presence in the territory who had to be watched. She had her accounts in good order, the careful columns of a woman who knew exactly what she had and what she owed and what she was building toward. Joel came to her land twice a week now, sometimes more. She went to his land sometimes, which was larger and had the particular ordered character of 8 years of careful work. The barn was solid, the corrals well built, the pastures managed with the attention of someone who understood long-term soil health. She walked his land with him and learned its features the way she'd learned her own, and he walked hers with her. And there was an intimacy in that, in knowing someone's land, that she had not anticipated but found entirely natural. He was quiet more often than not, but said things of substance when he spoke, and she had matched her rhythm to his naturally over weeks and months. And she thought sometimes, doing ordinary work, that she had not felt this particular ease with another person since Warren's letters, the sense of being known in the specific rather than the general, of being received rather than accommodated. She still had not heard him say directly what he felt for her, and she had not said directly what she felt for him, because they were both people who moved at the pace of what was real rather than the pace of what was wanted, and what was real was still assembling itself. Then, July brought a problem. Gerald Hatch, who had apparently not fully learned his lesson, made an attempt to claim the water rights to the Northwest Spring. He filed a complaint with the county land office claiming the spring had been used by his cattle before Alma arrived and therefore constituted a shared resource. It was legally flimsy, Joel said so flatly when Alma told him, and so did Sheriff Prout, but it required a response, and the county land office was in Santa Fe, which meant a journey. Alma said she would go. Joel said he would go with her because his testimony about the spring and the water use would be material, and also, and here he paused for a fraction of a second that she noted, because she should not have to make that journey alone. She looked at him across her kitchen table where they were eating supper, and she said, "You don't need to manage the distance for me." "I know I don't," he said. "I'd like to go with you. That's different." She held that for a moment, the distinction he'd drawn. "Yes," she said. "All right." They rode to Santa Fe over 2 days, stopping overnight at a way station that had rooms and edible food, which Alma managed efficiently and Joel managed with a practicality she respected. The way there was through landscape that was nothing less than spectacular in the way New Mexico landscape could be, the mountains rising, and the sky doing things with light that she still did not have the right words for, understanding now what Warren had meant about that. On the first day's ride, they talked for hours, which was unusual. Usually their conversations were shorter, punctuated by work or quiet, but the distance and the movement seemed to loosen something in both of them. He told her about his father in a way he hadn't before, the fullness of it, the man's specific character, the way he had worked himself past exhaustion to build the land claim, and the way Joel had sometimes resented that as a boy and then understood it completely as a man. She told him about her mother, who had been a teacher before she married, who had read to Alma every night until she was 12 and then handed her a library card and said the world was now hers. She sounds remarkable, Joel said. She was, Alma said. She believed that women who could read anything could do anything. She was right. She would have liked to see you here, he said. Alma looked at the road ahead and the mountains to the west. Yes, she said, she would have. They were quiet for a while and then Joel said, I've been thinking about something. She waited. I've been going to that platform every Tuesday for almost 2 years, he said. Even after I knew there was nothing to wait for on that train. Even after Ruth Alderman was married and I understood that whatever I had imagined was not going to happen. He kept his eyes on the road. I think I don't know exactly what I was doing. Keeping myself in a place that was finished, maybe, because it was easier than figuring out what came next. She did not rush to fill the silence. I stopped going last Tuesday, he said. It didn't feel like something to announce, I just stopped. She looked at him, the line of his face in the afternoon light, the steadiness of him on the horse. How did it feel, she asked. Like something that was supposed to happen, he said. She understood that, the rightness of a thing that had been waiting to be done. Good, she said quietly. He turned to look at her then, riding alongside him, and something passed between them that was wordless and exact, one of those moments that is not dramatic but is entirely real, that you know even as it happens is one of the ones that will matter. The land office in Santa Fe took 2 days to resolve. Alma presented her documentation with the organized clarity of a former bookkeeper, and Joel presented his testimony about the Springs location on Bristol land, and the officer in charge looked at Gerald Hatch's claim and found it unsupported. The ruling was clear. The Northwest Spring was unambiguously on Alma Bristol's property, and no shared use arrangement had ever been established. They celebrated by having a proper supper in a Santa Fe restaurant, which was a thing Alma had not done in months, and the table had a cloth on it and the food was good, and Joel looked at her across the table with the lamp between them and said, You handled that better than most men handle their own business. I'm aware, she said. He almost smiled. I'm paying you a compliment. I know, she said. I'm accepting it. I just want to be clear that I'm also aware that it shouldn't be remarkable. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said, you're right, it shouldn't be. And there was something in his voice that said he truly meant it, not as a concession but as an understanding, and she thought that was perhaps the most important thing she had learned about him. They rode back to Calder Flats the following day, and the ride was different from the ride out, warmer, quieter, the way a distance is different when you have shared something at the end of it. It was when they reached the junction where the road split, one way to his land and one way to hers, that he pulled up his horse and she pulled up hers and they were side by side in the late afternoon, the sun behind them now, the land ahead in all its reds and browns and the particular golden quality of New Mexico at the end of a summer day. He said, Alma, and stopped. She waited. He said, I would like to court you properly if you would allow it. Not as a neighbor helping out or as two people with adjacent land. I mean properly. She looked at him. She had known this was coming or something like it, and she had thought about how she would respond when it did. She had thought about what she wanted and whether it was wise and whether the particular kind of person she was could accommodate the particular kind of person he was, and the answer to all of it was yes, with a sureness that felt nothing like impulse. Yes, she said, I would allow it. He exhaled very slightly, the way someone exhales when they have been holding their breath without knowing it. All right, he said. Joel, she said. He looked at her. I'm not someone who does things in halves, she said. I want you to know that going in. Neither am I, he said. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. They parted at the junction, and she rode to her land and unsaddled her horse and fed it and went inside and stood in the middle of her cabin feeling the particular quality of this moment. Happiness, she thought, was not always loud. Sometimes it was this exact size. The Courting of Alma Bristol by Joel Ramsey was, by the standards of Calder Flats, both unremarkable in its form and remarkable in its effect. He came to supper twice a week, regular as weather. She went to his land on Sundays sometimes, and they worked side by side in the way they had from the beginning, which was itself a kind of intimacy. He brought her things, not gifts in the showy sense, but specific things. A book he'd traded for in town because he thought she'd want to read it. A piece of information about the cattle market that would be useful. Once a wildflower he had picked from the west edge of his property because he'd passed it and thought of her, which he had presented with the slight embarrassment of someone who is not given to gestures but had made one anyway. She had put the wildflower in a cup of water and set it on the windowsill, and when it dried she pressed it between 2 pages of Warren's last letter, and she did not tell him that, but she thought he might have understood it anyway. She kissed him for the first time in August, at the end of a supper at her table when they were standing in the doorway, and the night was full of stars the way New Mexico nights were, completely full, as if the dark itself were only a setting for the light. And she had looked at him, and thought that she had been practical and careful long enough, and she had reached up and kissed him with the decisiveness she brought to everything. And he had kissed her back with a depth and sincerity that made her understand something she had not fully understood before, which was that this man had been waiting not for a woman in Kansas City, but for the right person, and the right person had come from St. Louis on an eastbound train on a Wednesday. He held her face in his hands afterward, and he looked at her with the full green-gray intensity of his attention, and he said very quietly, I have been thinking about you since the first Thursday. The fence line, she said. The fence line, he agreed. You said you weren't here by accident. I wasn't, she said. Neither was I, he said. I think I've been here waiting for something I didn't have a name for yet. She leaned her head against his chest and heard his heart, steady and even, and she thought that was about as perfect a thing as she had encountered, and she allowed herself, just this once, to simply feel it without analyzing it or planning what came next. Autumn arrived and the land changed its colors, the grasses going amber and the mountains going deep blue, and the mornings sharpened in a way she had read about in Warren's letters but now felt on her skin. She had a good first-year count, not spectacular but solid, the kind of result that was the foundation of something larger. She had her accounts in order. She had her land in good order. She had sent a detailed letter to Warren's grave, or rather to Warren, who she still talked to sometimes in the way you keep talking to people who are gone when you have things to tell them. She told him about Joel. She also told Mabel Briggs, who already knew because Mabel Briggs knew everything, and who said with characteristic directness that she was glad, and that Joel Ramsey was a man who deserved to be happy and had been not unhappy but unfinished for too long. Alma thought that was exactly right. He had been unfinished, and she was not so vain as to think she was what finished him. She thought what had finished him was the decision to stop waiting for the wrong thing, but she was glad to be present for the finishing. Clara Yates told her, with elaborate satisfaction, that the whole town had noticed Joel wasn't going to the platform anymore, and that everyone agreed something had changed in him, and half the town suspected it had something to do with the Bristol woman, and Clara was now able to confirm that for the record. Alma said she hoped it would give people something to talk about besides their theories. Clara said it would give them much better things to talk about. She was not wrong. The fall roundup was successful, and Alma sold her first cattle at the Santa Fe market with Thomas Vega's help and netted enough to fund the next year's operations and have a modest surplus, which she documented carefully and allocated precisely. She felt, standing in the Santa Fe stockyard in October with the money in her satchel and the numbers balanced in her head, that she had done what she came to do. She had built the thing. It was small and young and needed more work, but it was real and it was hers. Joel met her at the junction when she rode home. He had come to meet her, which she had not expected, and the gesture was simple and it made her throat tight in the way things did when they were true. "Good sale?" he asked as they rode back side by side. "Very good," she said. "Then we should celebrate," he said. She looked at him. "2 times in 1 year," she said. "That's extravagant of you." He almost smiled. "You've earned extravagance." They had dinner at the hotel restaurant and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. His plans for the next year's herd, her plans for expanding the South Field, the state of the road to Santa Fe, the winter that was coming, the people in town who were good and the people who required watching. It was the kind of conversation that was both practical and profoundly pleasurable, and she thought she would never be able to fully explain to someone outside it what exactly was so good about it. The way it felt to talk to a person who matched you, not identically, but in the ways that mattered. On the ride home, their horses walking slowly in the October dark, he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him, the pale light making his face silvered and clear. He said, "I want to ask you to marry me. I want to ask you properly, but I also want to know first what you would think of it, whether it's something you want." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she had said to him in August at the junction. "I'm not someone who does things in halves." She thought about the space between her land and his, 4 miles, which was not far but which was also not here. "I would think," she said carefully, "that it depends on what marriage looks like." "Tell me what you mean," he said, because he was a man who wanted to understand precisely. "I mean that my land is mine," she said, "not in an unfriendly sense, in the sense that I have built it and planned it and it is the thing I came here to do. I would not want to stop doing it." "I know," he said, "I would not want you to stop. And my accounts stay my accounts," she said. "Yes," he said, "and decisions about my land are my decisions even if we discuss them." "Yes," he said. "And decisions about mine are mine, even if we discuss them." She looked at him in the October dark. "Then I would think," she said, "that it is something I want, very much." Exhaled again in that small, held way. "Then I'm asking you." "And I'm saying yes," she said. He pulled his horse to a stop and she pulled hers, and they were side by side in the dark with the stars overhead doing their extraordinary New Mexico thing, and he reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she held it, and they sat there for a moment in the silence of 2 people who have just settled something important and true. "When?" she asked eventually. "Soon," he said. "As soon as you like." "December," she said, "before the new year, so the next year starts as it means to go on." He nodded. "December," he said. She thought about Warren, who would have loved this. She thought about her mother, who would have asked 3 careful questions and then been satisfied. She thought about the 12 years of letters and the eastbound train and the land that had been waiting for her, and she thought that some things were built slowly and arrived all at once, and you had to be ready for the arriving. She was ready. They were married on the 14th of December, 1878, in the Calder Flats church, with Sheriff Prout and Mabel Briggs as witnesses and Ezra Polk and his wife Grace standing up with them, and Clara Yates crying openly in the 3rd pew, and Herbert Cobb blowing his nose into a large handkerchief. Thomas Vega sat in the back, his hat in his hands, and nodded once to Alma when she looked at him, which was his way of saying everything that needed to be said. The minister, a man named Reverend Cross, who had been in Calder Flats for 6 years, and who tended to find the specific detail in a general moment, said that he had presided over many marriages in this territory, and that some of them had been between people who needed each other and some between people who wanted each other, and the best ones were between people who were both, and that he was very happy to be officiating at one of the best ones. Alma, who had not cried yet, came close then. She held it together by keeping her eyes on Joel, who was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, not the guarded version but the open one, all the way open, the Creekwater eyes steady and clear. She said her vows in her full voice, clear and unhurried. He said his in the low, certain way he said everything that mattered. The reception was at the Calder house, where Mabel had prepared food in quantities that suggested she had been planning this for some time regardless of when it actually occurred. And the town of Calder Flats came through in the way small western towns did, all of them, in their various configurations of formality and informality, bringing food and goodwill, and in several cases, good whiskey. At some point in the evening when the room was warm and loud and full, Joel found Alma near the window and said, quietly just for her, "I want you to know that I am happier right now than I have been in a very long time." She looked up at him. "So am I," she said. "Happier than I planned for." He looked at her with a smile that was not adjacent to itself anymore but had become fully its own thing, open and real. "You planned for happiness. I planned for the land," she said. "This was not in the plan." "And yet," he said. "And yet," she agreed. He kissed her, right there by the window with the whole of Calder Flats present, which made Clara Yates cry again and Herbert Cobb clear his throat significantly, and Ezra Polk put his arm around his wife's shoulders, and the general feeling in the room was one of things being exactly as they should be. They had agreed, in the practical and specific manner of two people who had discussed their life together with care, that they would keep both properties operating, her land and his, and that they would live on his land, which was the larger operation, and hire Thomas Vega to manage the Bristol land with a hired hand added in the spring. The Bristol land would be hers, in its name and its accounts and its management. She would keep the ledger for both operations, because she was better at it, and Joel had said so without any difficulty, because he was a man without unnecessary pride about things that were simply true. The first winter of their marriage was cold and quiet and entirely wonderful in the way that first winters can be. She learned his house larger than the cabin, with a good stone fireplace, and a kitchen that Grace Polk had organized with considerable efficiency, and made it hers alongside his, the way she had made the cabin hers, incrementally, specifically. She put Warren's tin box of letters on the shelf in the sitting room, and Joel asked about it one evening, and she told him the whole of it, and he listened with the full attention he gave things that mattered. Then he got up and went to his bedroom, the room that was now their bedroom, and came back with a small wooden box, and he opened it and showed her what was in it. Letters, a substantial stack of them, tied with a piece of twine. "From my father," he said. "He wrote to me every week after I left Missouri, until he couldn't any more." She understood completely. "We should put them next to each other," she said, "on the shelf." He looked at her for a moment, and she thought she saw the particular quality of emotion that a person shows when they have been understood exactly, not approximately but exactly. "Yes," he said, "we should." The boxes went on the shelf side by side, and she thought that was about as honest and good a thing as she had seen in a long time. Spring came to New Mexico in 1879, the way it always did in that country, fast and vivid, the desert blooming with a color and abundance that still surprised her even though it was her second spring on the land. The cattle operation expanded as planned. Thomas Vega hired a hand, a young man named Carlos Ruiz, 19 years old, who was good with cattle and learning fast. The water from the northwest spring was piped through a simple channel to Joel's north pasture, which improved his water situation considerably, and the shared benefit of adjacent landowners working together rather than against each other was evident and practical and good. In March, Alma told Joel she was expecting. She told him in the evening at supper directly, because she did not know another way to tell anyone anything. She said she had been fairly certain for 3 weeks and was now certain, and the child would come in October, she thought. Joel Ramsey sat very still for a moment. Then he set down his fork and he looked at her, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. It simply opened, fully and without reservation, like a room with all its windows thrown wide, and she thought she had never seen anyone look so completely happy. He said, "Alma," and stopped. She looked at him. "Yes, I am." He stopped again, and then he said, "I don't have the right word." "Neither do I," she said, "but I know what I feel." He came around the table and he pulled her to her feet and held her, gently but absolutely. And she put her face against his chest and heard his heart, still steady. And she thought of Warren writing in his last letter that the land would love her back. And she thought that perhaps what he had meant was broader than the land. The summer of 1879 was hot and full, and she worked through most of it at a modified pace. Thomas Vega and Carlos took on more of the heavy work without being asked, because Thomas Vega was a man who noticed things and adjusted accordingly, which was one of the best qualities a person could have. Joel managed both operations through the summer with an attentiveness that was not hovering. He had learned the distinction between her needing help and his needing to be needed, and he had calibrated himself to the former rather than the latter, which she found remarkable and said so. He said, with the straight simplicity she had come to love in him, that he was not interested in being needed. He was interested in being useful. She said those were different things. He said yes, they were. On the 10th of October, 1879, their son was born. He was delivered by the town's doctor, a calm man named Dr. Halford, who had seen most of what there was to see and handled everything without drama, which Alma appreciated enormously. The labor was long and difficult, but she was strong, and it ended well. And Joel, who had been in the next room doing the particular kind of useless pacing that men do in those hours, came in when he was called and stood at the edge of the bed, and looked at the child in Alma's arms with an expression she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. They named him Warren Joel Ramsey, for the uncle who had written 12 years of letters about a land he loved, and left it to the only person he trusted to love it back. The town of Calder Flats received the news with the warmth of a community that has been watching a story unfold and is glad of its ending. Clara Yates sewed a blanket. Mabel Briggs brought a hamper of food. Grace Polk came every day for 2 weeks and managed the kitchen with a quiet authority that meant neither Alma nor Joel had to think about eating. Herbert Cobb gave them credit for 6 months of supplies without being asked, and said it was a gift for the baby, which was perhaps the most sentimental thing anyone had ever heard Herbert Cobb say. Sheriff Prout came to the door with his wife and a serious expression, and a very small pair of boots that Mrs. Prout had ordered made from a bootmaker in Santa Fe, and he said, with the particular formality of a man who was feeling something but was not built to display it openly, that he was glad things had turned out well, and that the territory could use more people of good character, and that he hoped the boy grew up to be like his parents. Alma thanked him, and Joel shook his hand, and after they left, Joel looked at the small boots and then at Alma with an expression that was uncomplicated and complete. "Good man," he said. "Yes," she said. Young Warren was, from the beginning, a child with his mother's eyes the decided green kind, and his father's steady quality of attention. He was curious and calm and grew with the directness of a child who has been both wanted and prepared for. He spent his earliest years moved between the house and the land, listening to the sounds of cattle and the sounds of his parents' conversations, which were both practical and warm in the way of two people who had learned each other's specific language. The two properties continued to operate through 1880 and into 1881, and the accounts were good. Not wealthy, this was New Mexico cattle work in the 1880s, which was a practical business with practical margins but solid, growing year by year, the kind of operation that could be handed down. Alma's ledgers were a thing of mathematical beauty that she kept with the precision of someone who understood that numbers were the truest record of how a thing was actually going. She hired a second hand for the Bristol land and began running a small number of horses alongside the cattle, which Thomas Vega had suggested, and which proved to be sound advice. There was a good market for working horses, and the land could support the mix. In late 1881, she told Joel she was expecting again. This time she told him in the morning over coffee, at the kitchen table, with Warren, now 2 and intensely mobile, attempting to climb the leg of a chair nearby. Joel looked at her, and this time the opening of his face was different, not less, but different, the way a second happiness is different from a first one, layered over it and within it rather than new from nothing. 2 children, he said. Perhaps, she said. We'll see what we get. What they got in June of 1882 was a daughter, born with considerably less difficulty than her brother, and with a pair of lungs that announced her arrival to anyone within considerable distance. They named her Clara Mabel Ramsey, the first name for Clara Yates, who had been generous and present throughout, and the second for Mabel Briggs, who had been the first person to tell Alma to trust herself in Calder Flats. When Mabel heard the name, she went quiet in a way that was entirely unlike her usual manner, and then she said, roughly, that she didn't see why they'd want to give a perfectly good child such an old name, and then she went to the kitchen and came back with a cake she had apparently made in advance because she had known, she said, that it would be a girl, which no one believed but everyone accepted. Clara Yates, upon hearing the name, did cry, which was expected. By the summer of 1882, the Ramsey operation was what could honestly be called established, not grand, but durable, the kind of thing built by 2 people who understood the difference between what they wanted and what they could actually sustain, and who had chosen sustainability without resentment because they were both, at their core, honest about the nature of things. They had built something real, both of them. Together, but not merged, Alma's land remained Alma's, with its own name and its own accounts, feeding into the family's whole but distinct within it. She had insisted on that and he had agreed with it, and the agreement had been solid for 4 years. She thought sometimes that this was the most important thing, that what they had built together had not required either of them to give up the essential truth of who they were. One evening in the fall of 1882, when Warren was nearly 3, and Clara Mabel was a few months old and both children were asleep, and the house was quiet with the particular peace of earned quiet, Alma and Joel sat on the front porch of the house and looked at the land in the last of the evening light. The mountains were doing their late October thing, going every color they had, and the air had the specific cold, clean smell of high desert autumn, and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Joel said, after a long and comfortable silence, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "I was thinking about the platform today," he said. "I haven't thought about it in a long time. And I was thinking about how I used to stand there and how it felt, and I couldn't fully reconstruct the feeling. It's like trying to remember cold when you're warm. You know it existed, you know it was real, but you can't actually feel it anymore." She was quiet, listening. "I think what I'm trying to say," he said, "is that I can't imagine any other version of this. I can't imagine the thing I was waiting for being anything other than what happened." She thought about that for a moment. She thought about Warren's letters and the 12 years of reading about a sky she hadn't yet seen. She thought about the bookkeeping, the careful planning, the St. Louis room and the ledger and the 3-year savings, and the day the lawyer's letter came, and the whole shape of her life pointing west before she knew it was pointing anywhere at all. "Neither can I," she said. "I've thought about that, whether I would change any of it. The bookkeeping, the planning, even my uncle being sick and leaving me the land instead of living long enough to meet me here, which I would obviously have preferred. But all of it put me on that train at exactly the right time. On the eastbound," he said, with the quiet amusement she had come to love, the very specific humor of a man who found things gently funny, and said so with the smallest possible inflection. "On the eastbound," she confirmed, "on a Wednesday, when you weren't at the platform." "Because I was there on Tuesdays," he said. "Because you were there on Tuesdays," she said. "But you found me anyway, 4 miles from your property line, setting a fence post at the right depth." He made a sound that was the most relaxed kind of laugh he did, the one she heard rarely enough that it still felt like something received rather than something ordinary. "You were so sure of yourself," he said. "I was terrified," she said. He turned to look at her. "Were you?" "Of course I was," she said. "I had just spent everything I had, financially and otherwise, on a land I'd never seen, with a neighbor dispute I hadn't anticipated, and no one I knew within 300 miles. She paused. "But I was not going to let any of that show until I was sure of the ground, and the only way to be sure of the ground was to work it." He shook his head slowly. "I think you were the bravest thing I had ever seen," he said, "and you were fixing a fence." She felt the warmth of that move through her, the specific warmth of being truly known. "You brought barbed wire the following month," she said. "That was your way of saying something." "It was," he admitted. "I thought it was subtle." "It was," she said. "I just happened to notice things." He took her hand, the way he did sometimes in the evening, simply and without announcement, and she held it in the autumn air, and they sat in the quiet of a built life, the children sleeping inside, the cattle settled, the mountains going dark against the last of the light, and she thought that this was the thing Warren had tried to describe in all those letters. Not the sky exactly, not the specific color or quality of the light, but the feeling of being entirely in the right place, at the right time, doing the right thing. With the right person. She had not expected the right person to be part of the plan. She had planned for the land, for the independence, for the work. She had not planned for the man who stood on a train platform every Tuesday, waiting without knowing what he was waiting for, with an expression that the whole territory could see and no one could explain. She had been what he was waiting for, and she had arrived on a Wednesday, on the wrong train, going the right direction, from the right life into a better one. And the whole of Calder Flats had watched Joel Ramsey change in the way a man changes when the thing he was waiting for arrives and turns out to be exactly what he needed, which was nothing like what he had imagined and everything like what he had always, in the deepest and most honest part of himself, wanted. She thought about that, about the whole territory knowing he was waiting, and no one knowing he was waiting for her, because she had not existed in their calculations of who he might be expecting. This woman from St. Louis on an eastbound train in April, who had come not because she had heard of him or been introduced or arranged anything, but simply because the land that was hers was here, and the life she was building was here. And he had been here already, steady as a fence post set at the right depth. And she had found him the way you find things you didn't know you were looking for. The October evening completed itself over the Sangre de Cristo range, the sky going full dark with its customary abundance of stars, and the lamp inside the house burned warm through the window. And inside that house slept Warren, who had his mother's eyes and his father's patience, and Clara Mabel, who had everybody's lungs, and the tin box and the wooden box sitting side by side on the shelf with 12 years of letters and a father's correspondence, all the love that had been written down and kept. Alma leaned her head against Joel's shoulder in the dark. He put his arm around her, and she felt the steadiness of him, the particular kind of steadiness she had recognized on the very first day, not rigidity, not stubbornness, but the deep groundedness of someone who has decided where they are and committed to it fully. "Next year," she said into the quiet, "I want to expand the South Field." She felt him breathe in amusement. "Right now," he said. "I'm always planning," she said. "I know," he said. "Tell me about the South Field." So she did, in the comfortable dark, with the stars overhead in their extravagant quantity. And he listened in the way he listened to things that mattered, with all of his attention. And she talked about cattle numbers and grass rotation, and the survey she wanted to commission. And underneath the practicality of it was the simple fact of two people talking about a shared future, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, which it was, which it had become, which it would remain. The whole territory knew that Joel Ramsey had stopped going to the platform some years back, and everyone in Calder Flats knew exactly why, and the story of it had settled into the town's history the way good stories do, not as gossip, but as something that was just true, part of the fabric of the place. Herbert Cobb told it to new arrivals sometimes, because it was a good story and he had been present for it. Mabel Briggs told it more accurately and with less elaboration. Clara Yates told it with the most elaboration of all, which meant the most detail and also the most feeling, and she never failed to mention that she had been the one to tell Alma Bristol that Joel Ramsey was at the platform every Tuesday, which was true and which had perhaps accelerated certain things, though Alma always said privately that it would have happened regardless, because the truth of things that are meant to happen is that they happen. You just don't always know in advance which Wednesday you'll arrive. The land kept going the way good land does, the ledgers balanced, the children grew. Warren learned to ride at 4, serious and deliberate as his father, and Clara Mabel learned at the same age with a boldness that made Thomas Vega quietly proud. The northwest spring ran clear and cold through every season. The south field was expanded in 1883, as planned, and proved itself. Joel's north pasture flourished with the water from the shared spring, and the two properties ran alongside each other like partners, which was what they were, two distinct things, intelligently connected, stronger for the connection and not diminished by it. On a Tuesday in the spring of 1884, Alma walked to the train platform in Calder Flats. Joel was with her. They had come to town for supplies, and she held his hand as the westbound train pulled in, which it always did at 10:30, reliable as the season. They watched it arrive in the cloud of steam and noise that was still, even after 6 years, a remarkable thing in the middle of that landscape, this roaring metal thing crossing the desert, connecting everywhere to everywhere else. August Farley was at the station. He had been the station master since before either of them could remember, and he nodded to them both in the comfortable way of a man who has seen most of what there is to see from a train platform, and found it generally instructive. The train sat for its 20 minutes, and the few passengers who were getting off got off, and the few who were getting on got on, and the thing roared back to life and moved west, and they watched it go. Joel looked at the space where the train had been. Alma looked at him. "Strange feeling?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "not strange." He turned to her, and his face had none of the old quality she had heard described, not the held thing, not the ache, only the open, clear expression of a man who is standing exactly where he should be. "Just ordinary," he said. "Just a train." She squeezed his hand. "Just a train. Just a Tuesday." Just the sound of it going west on the tracks, fading into the distance, leaving behind a platform and a station master, and two people who had found each other the long way around through letters and waiting and fence posts and coffee and barbed wire and a spring, and a land office in Santa Fe, and a December wedding, and 2 children and 4 years of work, and all the small dailies of a life that is being built by people who are serious about it. She looked out at the main street of Calder Flats, at the town that knew everything, that had watched and speculated and wondered, that had been present for all of it. Then she looked at Joel, who was already looking at her, as he so often was. "Ready to get the supplies?" she asked. "Yes," he said. They walked back up the street together in the bright spring morning, in the land she had come to from 12 years of letters, in the life she had not planned for and could not now imagine having missed. Behind them, the platform stood empty and ordinary in the New Mexico sun, and August Farley went back inside his station house, and the whole of Calder Flats went on about its day, and every single person in it knew that whatever Joel Ramsey had once been waiting for, he had found it, and that she had found it too, and that the finding had been good, and that what they had built was solid and true and fully theirs, and that was more than enough. It was, in the generous and specific language of a life well lived, everything.